Wet wood doesn't burn. Everyone who had ever survived a northern winter knew that rule the way they knew the ache of cold in their bones. You could argue with neighbors, with preachers, with the government if you liked, but not with fire. Fire told the truth. Wet wood hissed, smoked, and died. Dry wood burned clean and hot, or it did not burn at all. Minnesota Territory, summer of 1887. Eliza Norberg stood barefoot in the packed dirt outside her cabin, a piece of charcoal smudging her fingers black as she sketched lines on a flattened sheet of birch bark. The sun was high, the air warm enough to lull foolish people into forgetting what was coming. She did not forget. She never did. Her drawing looked wrong to anyone who passed by. The cabin, small, square, ordinary, was surrounded by something extra. A roof that stretched outward on three sides, held up by posts, enclosing space where there should have been nothing but open ground and drifting snow. It looked less like a home and more like a shelter wrapping its arms around itself. Men rode past slowly. Women paused at a distance, baskets on their hips. No one said anything to her face, but Eliza felt the weight of their eyes. A widow alone was already a curiosity. A widow measuring timber and drawing plans was something else entirely. She ignored them. She measured the ground again with a length of rope, tied with careful knots. 8 feet out from the cabin wall. Far enough to stack wood floor to ceiling. Close enough to reach without stepping into a storm. Someone laughed from the road. Not cruelly, worse than that. Amused. Eliza did not look up. Wetwood doesn't burn, she thought, pressing the charcoal harder as she drew. And winter does not forgive mistakes. The cabin measured 16 by 20 feet. Eliza knew every inch of it the way a sailor knows the lines of a familiar shore. Jonah Norberg had built it 3 years earlier, cutting the logs himself, fitting them together with patient hands and a quiet pride. It had been meant as a beginning. Now it was a boundary. What stood between her and the cold? People said Jonah had died of illness. That was the version Eliza allowed to live. Fever was a neat ending. Fever did not invite questions. Fever did not ask how or why or whether something could have been done differently. She let them believe it. The truth lived in the spaces she did not speak of, in the way her eyes tracked the distance between buildings, in the way she counted steps without thinking, in the way her hand tightened whenever the wind rose suddenly. The cabin sat in a clearing bordered by birch and oak, trees that looked friendly in summer and turned into silent witnesses in winter. In a few months their leaves would fall, and then snow would bury everything. Roads would vanish. Paths would lie. Landmarks would disappear. 6 months of winter. 6 months where fire decided everything. Eliza stepped onto the threshold and looked back at the doorframe Jonah had squared by hand. The stove sat inside, solid and dependable. It could keep a room warm if it was fed properly. That was the part people forgot. Fire was not magic. It needed preparation. Last winter had taught her that. She could already feel it, even in July, the pressure of the coming season. The way time tightened once the days began to shorten. The way every mistake made in summer waited patiently to punish you in January. This cabin had been built to survive. But survival depended on what surrounded it. Eliza folded the birch bark and tucked it into her pocket. She had no intention of waiting to see if hope alone would be enough. "You're going to build what?" Caleb Monroe stood a few paces back, his hat pushed up as he squinted at the lines Eliza had redrawn on a scrap of paper. He had ridden over with a sack of flour and the vague obligation neighbors felt toward widows, checking in, offering help that was rarely specific enough to matter. "A roof extension," Eliza said, not looking up. "On 3 sides." Caleb frowned and walked a slow circle around the cabin, boots scuffing the dirt. "Looks like you're trying to turn your house into a shed." "I'm turning my house into shelter," she replied. "For firewood?" "For anything that needs to stay dry," she said calmly. "But mostly for firewood." He stopped, hands on his hips. "Why not just build a woodshed like everyone else?" Eliza straightened and met his eyes. Because everyone else runs out of drywood by February. Caleb laughed, the sound surprised out of him. That's just winter. No, she said. That's poor planning. She pointed toward the open ground beside the cabin. I'll stack the wood here. Under a solid roof. Raised off the ground. Airflow from the sides. Months of drying before the first snow falls. That's a lot of lumber. A lot of work. I have the summer. And what about snow load? Wind? Weight pulling on your cabin walls? I've calculated it, she said. Posts will carry the load. The roof will pitch away from the cabin. Snow will slide before it builds. Caleb studied her more carefully now. People are going to talk. They already are. He hesitated. It's not how things are done. Eliza folded the paper with deliberate care. What looks foolish in summer decides who lives in winter. Caleb had no answer for that. He nodded once, uncertain, and mounted his horse. As he rode away, he glanced back at the widow with the strange plans and wondered, uncomfortably, if she knew something he didn't. Eliza waited until she was alone again before walking to the spot where the old woodshed had stood. It was gone now. She had torn it down in the spring, board by board, until nothing remained but bare ground and a memory she could finally look at without breaking. Jonah had died there. Not inside the shed. Between the shed and the house. Less than 30 feet. A blizzard had come down fast, the kind that erased the world in minutes. He had gone out for more wood because the fire was fading. Because he thought he could make it. Because everyone thought they could make it. He had lost the door. Lost the line of the cabin. Lost his direction in a white roar that swallowed sound and sense alike. By the time Eliza found him, when the storm eased just enough, he was already still. People said fever because that was kinder. Eliza said nothing because rage would not bring him back. But resolve, that was something else. She knelt and pressed her palm into the dirt. Never again, she said aloud, the words steady. Not angry. Certain. She stood and looked back at the cabin, imagining the roof extended, the wood stacked close, the distance between warmth and death reduced to a few steps under cover. She would build it. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. Let them call her foolish. Winter was coming. And Eliza Norberg intended to be ready. Eliza began before dawn. The air was cool enough to make her breath visible, a reminder that summer was already tipping towards something colder. She tied her hair back, checked the edge of the axe with her thumb, and walked into the trees with the steady purpose of someone who knew exactly why she was there. She chose her pines carefully, straight trunks, few knots, tall enough to give her the length she needed for posts. Her father had taught her how to read a tree long before she ever came west. Look at how it leans. Listen when the wind moves through it. The tree will tell you where it wants to fall. She cut a notch on the side she wanted, clean and angled. Then she worked the opposite side, swinging until the trunk creaked and complained. When it finally fell, the crash echoed through the forest like a declaration. Each tree on the ground was proof. Not of strength alone, but of ownership. This land. This work. This future. By midday her shoulders burned and her hands tingled from the vibration of each strike. She welcomed the ache. Pain meant progress. Pain meant she was not waiting for someone else to decide whether she deserved to survive another winter. She limbed the fallen trees, stacked branches for later use, and marked the logs she would keep for beams and rafters. Sweat soaked her dress. Pine sap stuck to her fingers. None of it mattered. When the sun dipped low, she stood in the clearing and counted. 4 posts cut. 2 beams selected. Tomorrow, more. The men who rode past slowed, watching from a distance. A few shook their heads. One offered to help if she changed her mind about doing it the hard way. Eliza lifted the axe again and went back to work. The hard way, she knew, was the only way that lasted. At night, Eliza traded muscle for numbers. She sat at the small table inside the cabin with a stub of pencil and scraps of paper, her calculations spreading outward like a map. Post spacing. Load distribution. Roof pitch steep enough to shed snow but shallow enough to build alone. She worked by lamplight, the steady tick of cooling logs in the stove her only company. 12 posts. 10 feet tall. Set on stone footings so spring thaw wouldn't swallow them. Beams notched to lock in place without relying on nails that might loosen with time. Rafters spaced close enough to carry twice the expected snow load. She did not guess. Guessing killed people. Then came the firewood math. An average winter burned 8 cords if you rationed. 10 if you wanted comfort. She planned for 15. Wood stacked floor to ceiling. Raised off the ground. Open sides for airflow. Covered from above. Moisture was the enemy, not cold. Moisture stole heat before the fire could give it. She paused, pencil hovering. Last winter she had counted logs the way some people counted coins. 1 more hour of heat. 1 more night. Jonah had gone out because she had miscalculated. Because she had assumed the shed was enough. Never again. Grief did not leave her. It sharpened. Every number on the page was a refusal to be surprised by winter. Every line she drew was a wall against panic. By the time the lamp burned low, she had a plan detailed enough that nothing remained vague. Uncertainty was what fear fed on. Eliza starved it. The talk found her anyway. It always did. At the well. At the church steps. In voices that dropped when she came near but rose again as soon as she passed. She's working herself to death. A woman alone shouldn't be doing that kind of labor. She ought to remarry. That would solve it. Eliza heard it all. She carried water beside women who glanced at her hands, calloused now, scarred in places, and shook their heads with a mix of pity and disapproval. Martha Klein was the boldest. "You can't build your way out of loneliness," she said one afternoon, arms folded tight. Eliza set her bucket down carefully. "I'm not trying to." "Well, what happens when you fall sick? Or get hurt?" "Then I'll be sick in a warm house," Eliza replied. "With dry wood." That ended the conversation. She did not argue. Arguments wasted energy better spent on work. Reputation did not keep frost from creeping across the floor at night. Approval did not feed a stove. The men were quieter but no less skeptical. They measured her stacks, counted her trees, muttered about weight and strain and foolish pride. Let them. Every hour they spent talking was an hour she spent building. By late August, the clearing behind her cabin had changed. Logs stacked neatly in rows. Posts peeled and drying. Beams laid out with chalk marks. The season was turning. Nights cooled faster. The sun dipped earlier. Eliza did not slow. Ash followed her everywhere. The dog was not large, lean, dark-coated, with one ear that never quite stood straight, but he was constant. He lay in the shade while she worked, rose when she moved, watched the trees fall with alert, intelligent eyes. At night he curled near the stove, head on his paws, breathing slow and steady. The silence pressed in then. The kind that reminded her of what was missing. Eliza sat on the cabin steps one evening, watching the last light fade from the clearing. Timber stacked high now. Enough to build. Enough to begin. Summer was slipping away. She could feel it in the air, in the way Ash's breath fogged faintly when he exhaled. She rested a hand on his head. "We're almost ready," she murmured. The dog's tail thumped once. Behind them, the cabin waited. Ahead of them, winter gathered itself. Eliza rose, brushed the sawdust from her skirt, and went inside. Tomorrow, the building would begin. Eliza resisted asking for help longer than she should have. Not out of pride, out of habit. Since Jonah's death, she had learned that waiting for assistance often meant waiting forever. Still, when the time came to raise the posts, the truth was unavoidable. A 10-foot pine, thick and heavy, did not care how determined you were. It required 2 sets of hands, 2 bodies leaning into the same moment. She saddled the mare at dawn and rode to Caleb Monroe's place. He looked surprised when she explained what she needed, then thoughtful. When? Today, if you can. He nodded once. I'll bring my tools. They worked in near silence, digging the last footing holes, lowering flat stones into place, checking level twice before standing the first post upright. Caleb braced while Eliza guided, her hands sure, her movements economical. Now, she said. Together they pushed. The post rose, slow and stubborn, until it settled into vertical. Eliza packed earth around the base, tamping it firm. The post did not move. Caleb stepped back, eyes narrowing. You set these stones right. I don't intend to reset them in spring. By the 3rd post, his doubt had faded. By the 6th, admiration had taken its place. You've done this kind of work before, he said, not as a question. My father, she replied. Carpenter. He believed bad work was a kind of lie. They raised all 12 posts by sundown. When they finished, the cabin stood encircled by raw timber, a promise taking shape in the dirt. Caleb wiped his brow. I thought you were chasing a notion. Eliza looked at the posts, straight and solid. And now? He met her gaze. Now I think you're building something people are going to copy. Once the posts were set, Eliza worked alone again. She rigged a simple pulley system from the cabin's roof peak, rope, iron hook, patience. Each beam was hauled into place inch by inch, sweat darkening her collar as she guided the timber into its notched seat. She worked slowly. Rushing made mistakes. Mistakes cost fingers. Or worse. 1 beam a day at first. Then 2. She learned how to balance weight, how to let gravity do part of the work. She learned where to stand and where not to. The rafters followed, dozens of them, spaced with careful precision. Too far apart and the roof would sag under snow. Too close and she'd waste precious lumber. She measured twice, cut once, and trusted her numbers. There were moments of fear. A beam slipping before she caught it. A rope burning her palm as it slid too fast. Each time, she stopped, breathed, and adjusted. Pain was information. She listened to it. From the road, the structure began to make sense. Neighbors slowed their horses. Children pointed. The outline of the roof extended like sheltering wings around the cabin. It's holding, someone murmured. By the end of August, the skeleton stood complete. Posts, beams, rafters, all locked together. It looked permanent. It looked intentional. It looked like something meant to last. The shingles nearly broke her. She split them by hand from cedar blocks, one after another, driving the froe with a mallet until the wood gave way in clean, tapered pieces. The work demanded strength and finesse in equal measure. Her hands blistered, then hardened. Her shoulders burned. At night, she soaked her fingers in cold water and bound them in cloth, then rose before dawn to do it again. Each shingle was a small victory. She nailed them in overlapping rows, careful to angle them just so, guiding water away from the structure. When rain came, and it did, she watched it bead and slide off, never touching the ground beneath. Winter could rage all it liked. The roof would turn it aside. By the 3rd week, her body ached constantly. There were moments when she leaned against the cabin wall and wondered how much more she could give. Then she remembered Jonah, 30 feet from safety. She picked up the hammer. Each nail she drove was a refusal. Against cold. Against chance. Against the idea that survival was something you waited for instead of built. September arrived with cool mornings and gold-edged leaves. Eliza stepped back and looked at her cabin, and barely recognized it. The extended roof wrapped around 3 sides, 8 feet deep, supported by the posts she had raised and the beams she had hoisted. The space beneath was open, dry, waiting. Neighbors came, uninvited now. They walked the perimeter, touched the timber, tested the beams with their weight. Nothing shifted. "Well," someone said finally. "I'll be damned." Caleb stood a little apart, watching Eliza instead of the structure. "You were right," he said quietly. She nodded once. The work had already said everything else. The cabin no longer stood alone. It was protected. Prepared. Winter could come when it pleased. October was for splitting. Eliza rose before the sun and worked until it dipped behind the trees, the steady rhythm of axe against log becoming as familiar as her own heartbeat. She split oak and birch, stacked pine kindling, sorted each piece by size and purpose. The work was repetitive, brutal, and deeply satisfying. The covered porch filled slowly, then all at once. Row after row of firewood rose beneath the extended roof, stacked from the plank floor to the rafters. 15 cords in total, more fuel than she had ever possessed in her life. The wood was light in her hands, already beginning to season, protected from rain and frost by the roof overhead and the open sides that let wind pass through. She built the stacks like walls, leaving narrow gaps for airflow, marking each section so she could rotate use from oldest to newest. Nothing would be wasted. People noticed. At first, they only stared. Then they asked questions. "How much you got there?" "Enough," Eliza answered. "How'd you keep it so dry?" She gestured upward. "It never touches snow. Never touches ground." Some nodded thoughtfully. Others frowned, recalculating their own stores too late. By November, the nights were cold enough to freeze water in open buckets. The first light snow dusted the clearing, melting away by afternoon but leaving a warning behind. Eliza stood on the porch, hand resting on a stack of dry oak, and felt a quiet confidence settle into her bones. For the first time since Jonah's death, winter did not feel like a threat. The storm came fast. Snow began as a whisper, then thickened until the world blurred at the edges. Wind rose, driving flakes sideways, erasing landmarks and distances alike. By nightfall, the cabin seemed adrift in a white sea. Eliza recognized the signs. The sudden pressure drop. The way sound vanished. The way fear crept in if you let it. This was the kind of storm that killed. She shut the shutters, checked the stove, and set water near the fire. Ash paced once, then settled, sensing her calm. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the roof. Snow piled against the outer posts, but the structure held. The pitch of the roof sent drifts sliding off in heavy sheets. Eliza stood at the window, watching the white swallow everything beyond a few feet. Her breath caught, not in panic, but memory. Jonah had stepped into a storm like this. She closed her eyes for a moment. Counted her breaths. Then opened them again. Fear was a luxury. Preparation was power. The fire burned low. She needed more wood. Eliza opened the door. The wind slapped at her face, sharp and biting, but she did not step into it. The covered porch wrapped around her like an arm. Snow slid off the roof overhead, never touching the ground beneath. 3 steps. That was all. She reached into the nearest stack and pulled free an armload of dry wood. Light. Clean. Ready. No snow clung to it. No moisture hissed when she tested a piece near the stove. She was outside less than 5 seconds. Inside, the fire accepted the logs eagerly, flames leaping high and steady. Warmth spread through the cabin, driving back the cold as if it had never entered. Eliza stood by the stove, listening to the confident crackle of good fuel. Somewhere beyond the white, her neighbors were making choices. She imagined them digging through drifted paths to their woodsheds, hands numbing as they hauled in logs heavy with snow. She imagined smoke-filled rooms, fires that refused to catch, rationing hours of heat like stolen coins. The contrast was brutal. The storm raged for 3 days. Eliza burned wood freely. She slept warm. Water never froze. Ash dozed by the fire, twitching in his dreams. On the second night, she heard a distant shout carried on the wind. By morning, she knew she would not be staying inside. When the wind finally eased, Eliza strapped on her snowshoes and loaded a sledge with dry firewood. She went first to Caleb. His cabin was cold enough that her breath fogged inside. Wet logs steamed uselessly in his stove, filling the room with smoke but little heat. His hands shook as he tried to tend the fire. "The shed drifted shut," he said hoarsely. "Everything's soaked." Eliza said nothing. She stacked wood by his door and rebuilt his fire in minutes. She did the same for the Kleins. For old Mrs. Havelock, who lived alone and had already burned her last good logs. For anyone who needed it. No speeches. No judgment. Only action. By the time she returned home, word had spread. The widow with the strange porch had saved lives. No one laughed now. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like a hand reluctant to let go. By the time the snow melted enough to reveal ground again, something in the valley had shifted. People walked past Eliza's cabin with different eyes now, not curious, not amused, but measuring. They counted posts. Noted roof pitch. Studied how the wood sat stacked, dry and untouched by rot. The laughter did not return with spring. Questions did. How far out did you set the posts? How steep is the roof? How much wood can you fit under there? Eliza answered when asked. She did not guard the knowledge. Knowledge wasn't something you hoarded when it could keep people alive. That summer, the sound of axes echoed across the valley, not just from her land, but from others. First one porch appeared. Then another. Some were smaller. Some only wrapped one side of a cabin. But the idea was unmistakable. Covered. Close. Dry. The men who had doubted now argued over details. The women who had pitted now planned. Children grew up assuming houses simply came that way, never knowing it had once been strange. By autumn, half a dozen homesteads had built their own versions. By the next winter, no one in the valley froze fetching firewood. What had begun as one woman's refusal to accept loss quietly had become habit. And habit, once established, was stronger than tradition. Eliza married Caleb Monroe 2 springs later. No one called it a rescue. No one pretended it was charity or necessity. They married because they worked well together. Because they spoke plainly. Because neither expected the other to be smaller than they were. The ceremony was held beneath the covered porch. Neighbors stood close, sunlight filtering through the rafters, the stacked firewood forming a rough, honest backdrop. Eliza wore a simple dress she had sewn herself. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt and no borrowed confidence. When they spoke their vows, there was no flourish. Just promises that sounded like plans. Afterward, someone joked that it was fitting she married under the thing she'd built. Eliza smiled at that. Love, she had learned, was not about being saved. It was about choosing to build together once you already knew how to stand alone. The years moved the way years always do, quietly, then all at once. Children came. The cabin expanded. New rooms were added, walls extended, floors reinforced. Caleb built well, but he never suggested removing the porch. No one ever did. It stayed. Firewood stacked beneath it every fall. Tools hung from its posts. Children learned to walk there, then learned to stack kindling straight and true. Winters came and went, some mild, some merciless. The porch never failed. Ash grew old. His muzzle went gray. One winter morning, he did not rise from his place by the stove. They buried him in the clearing where the sun reached early, the porch casting a soft shadow nearby. Eliza pressed her palm to the post she had raised decades earlier. It was smooth now, worn by time and touch. Good work lasts, she murmured. By the time she was old enough that the cold bothered her bones, the valley barely remembered a time before covered porches. The idea had traveled beyond them, through word, through imitation, through winters survived. No one asked who thought of it first. Eliza didn't mind. After Eliza died, her granddaughter found the notebook. It lay tucked into a cedar chest beneath folded linens and old letters, the pages yellowed but intact. Sketches filled the margins. Measurements. Load calculations. Notes written in a hand that grew steadier, then shakier, over time. On the first page, a single sentence was written larger than the rest. Wetwood doesn't burn. Below it, added later in smaller script. Everything important starts there. With the truth you can't ignore. The final pages held no drawings. Only words. Winter kills people who trust habits more than reason. Build close to what keeps you alive. If something looks foolish but works, keep it. The granddaughter closed the notebook with a quiet sense of awe. She had grown up warm. She had never rationed firewood. She had never feared stepping outside for heat. Now she knew why. The cabin still stands. The porch has been rebuilt twice, the wood replaced as it aged, but the design remains unchanged. Visitors walk through and admire it, rarely asking who first thought to build that way. Eliza Norberg's name may fade. Her idea does not. And now, a word to you. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that survival often begins with one quiet, stubborn decision, then take a moment. Like this story to honor resilience. Comment with the lesson that stayed with you. Subscribe for more stories where courage isn't loud, but it lasts. Because the ideas that save lives are often the ones everyone laughs at first.